I know that you think you could run your favourite cricket team better than those who do, but no one is going to let you do that. So why not try Wicket Cricket Manager to satisfy that urge? Pick your nation, pick your league, pick your players, and yell at them when they do poorly. You can find it in the links below or by searching for Wicket Cricket Manager in your app store today. If you're enjoying these live chats, our main channel has even more World Cup videos looking at the greatest performances, the quirkiest stats, and the epic tales of World Cup cricket. Cricket is about partnerships, and this show was made in partnership with HCLTech. Yeah, the company you see on the Australian shirts. Supercharge your technology with them today. Welcome to Uncovered. Flying solo today. Bayram is out, not omitted, rested, rotated, traded, I suppose, being one of the topics we'll be talking about today. Might also be quite apt. I'll go through quite a few of the different things that I have been seeing around the cricket world. But I did want to start with the IPL news. I think that is one of the more, well, certainly these days, it's weirdly very global, isn't it? Which I suppose is completely on brand for this podcast. But I did find it very interesting. Obviously, Hardik Pandya has been traded for cash. Anyone who's been a fan of my work before will know that IPL teams should not be trading for cash. It's a terrible plan. I don't understand why it keeps happening. But, you know, I don't know what to say. Trades in T20 cricket are just so often... It's like you don't realize you're going to play this other team. You need to take some resources. Even if you don't want those resources, find out if any other team might want those resources, players I'm talking about here. Get a couple of players back and then flip those players to the team who actually wants them to try and get something else out of the situation. You can't just have one of the teams you're going up against essentially buy the best seam bowling all-rounder in India, where it doesn't matter to them. Money doesn't matter to them Mumbai Indians. Anyway, I thought that was quite interesting, and I'm sure that I'll be sucked into the whole trade thing again. But, you know, Jofra Archer is, you know, while we're on Mumbai, very, very interesting that they've moved on from him. Probably tells us that they, you know, I mean, they sort of set their franchise up around the fact that Jofra Archer would eventually be fit and healthy, and they were willing to perhaps even lose the season waiting for him. I think they've probably lost their patience at this point. And like the rest of us, probably like Jofra as well, we don't know if he will ever come back consistently. You know, I don't. As long as he can bowl, teams will still take punts on him. I expect him to get picked up by someone else. But I think we've seen that the, you know, I think we've seen enough to be where you wouldn't want to pay a lot of money for him. And obviously he was on a big contract before, but he will get picked up again. It was actually, Harry Brook was another one I was very, very interested in. Obviously he makes that 100, which makes his overall T20 numbers, well, IPL numbers look a little bit better. But we've seen this again, probably cost too much. I remember saying at the time that it's a big amount to play on someone who is not fully tested. I suppose that's the best way of putting it. And we've seen that time and time again. I think it was Cameron Green just traded. Am I right in saying that? Yeah. So Cameron Green has been traded from Mumbai to RCB. Obviously, part of that is probably the Hardik Pandya thing as well. Again, if you were a T20 franchise who was giving Hardik Pandya to Mumbai Indians, could you not have asked for Cameron Green and a couple of other players and then traded them on to RCB so that you got something else back for the trade? Especially because RCB were offloading a lot of players as well. Anyway, that's a completely separate thing. But that's what I'm talking about when I talk about how bad the trades are. But the point being that if you go back, especially and you have a look a little bit with Harry Brook, but certainly with Cameron Green, I talked about the fact that we don't know how his worth is going to come across in the IPL. And I think in the IPL, there are a lot of teams who spend a lot of money on players that we don't actually know that much about yet. And I know you don't want to be left out. You don't want to be in a situation where you miss out on the next big thing. But you do have to look at what these players have done and trial them a little bit more effectively or have better scouting reports on them and everything else. I just feel like at the moment it's still like this is the hot property, so we all want this player. Anyway, Brooke is out, and Archer and Cameron Green has changed teams as Hardick has. So I think I've named all of those ones. I'm just trying to think who were the other players on the list that I thought were quite interesting. I mean, RCB seems to be clearing house. We've seen this sort of thing quite a lot. Hazelwood, I think, couldn't come back because of paternal issues. So he wanted to spend some time with his family. It's quite interesting that he's doing that, actually, because he's had a pretty decent World Cup here, and he was desperate to get himself back into the IPL and T20 franchises in general, and the Australian team as a white ball player. So good on him for putting his family first after doing all that hard work. Harshal Patel's a really, really interesting one as well. I've been fascinated by him. I think that with Harshal Patel, there's a big chance of overpaying him as a player. But really what you want to do with Harshal Patel is probably get him on a reasonable contract for as long a period as you can, because when you put as many revolutions on the ball as people like him and Darren Bravo do, there are going to be down years where they just can't put the same amount of revolutions on the ball, which means that you're not as useful. Hasaranga was also let go from RCB. Probably he's a perfect case of a bowler who will probably go to a more spin-friendly conditions and will do really, really well. The truth is that RCB in part go through so many bowlers because it's a very hard place to bowl. And I don't know if they have, as a franchise, historically factored that in enough. And it's a hard one, but kind of have to, right? It's like if Guyana got rid of every batter who averaged 28 with a strike rate of 110. Well, that's kind of everyone who plays in Guyana because the pitches are a bit like that. KKR, they let 12 players go today. A lot of these were players that I just think make sense for them to move on from. Shakib Al Hasan, who actually I just saw just before he did this, Muhammad Isam has said that Shakib Al Hasan is contesting the 12th parliamentary elections after getting a nomination from the Awami League, which is the ruling party. I think I've got all that right. Just can't wait to see the sort of people that will vote for Shakib Al Hasan. And I hope he got his nomination in on time. If you didn't get that joke, hopefully someone will explain it to you later on. But so moving on from Shakib, I think makes sense based on current form and everything else. Was probably one of the most undervalued IPL players for a long period of time, but certainly not at that level anymore. Lockie Ferguson, KKR moved on from him. I said when they got Lockie back that they got him back for almost romantic reasons, because when you looked at his numbers, they hadn't held up. The interesting thing is now he looks back in form and looks fit again. So it's an interesting time to get rid of him. And I suppose the other big change that they made was Shardul Thakur. Teams have tried to make him work as a T20 player for a long time. Probably from a batting perspective, last couple of years, he's finally given you something with the bat, but his bowling is, I mean, he's the least economical bowler in the IPL and has been consistently, I think, over a long period of time. He's a smart cricketer, and it's interesting to me. He just hasn't worked out how to make it work consistently. But again, certainly a player who will be picked up by someone else. I just don't know how he fits into a T20 side because he's so expensive without really giving you masses of wickets. You'd almost have to have a pretty set bowling lineup where you could see how he can bowl the safest overs in while giving yourself, a number 8 who will occasionally pinch it up the order. He should be more successful than he is. But I think that the price that people have paid for him has been part of the problem. He's been massively overpaid for someone who just doesn't, who needs to be, you almost need to build the team around him. And then how often do you want to build a team around someone who is, your 8th or 9th best player at best, right? These things don't happen all that often. Who else went? Kyle Jamieson went from CSK. I think, again, you see, go back. I do think Kyle Jamieson has a role to play in a T20 franchise cricket. I don't know if it's in the IPL, just because unless you give him the absolute new ball, and teams haven't done that enough with him. I still think he has some use, but he was overpaid. Well on the record of this, he probably should have been picked up a couple of years earlier than he was, and then should have been paid a reasonable amount of money, and then could have developed properly. Again, we see these players get overpaid. And Jason Holder was let go by Rajasthan Royals. The problem with Jason Holder is, as a bowler, again, he's probably not an ideal new ball bowler. It's not even as good, certainly not as good as Kyle Jamieson is. The rest of the innings, he doesn't really do a lot for you. And in the death, he could take wickets, but you would need him to be paired with someone who's an incredible economy bowler, which is perhaps the idea of having him and Obed together. But Obed, with his injuries, just never could string enough games together. He's been let go as well. And Jason Holder's batting is fine, but he's also not a specialist batter, right? Like, you could bat him at number 5, knowing that you have a slightly weaker number 5 or a number 6 or anything like that. Again, I don't think he should be let go altogether, but he's a tricky player. So a lot of the guys that have gone on there either were in bad form or just not doing what they should be. There'll be a lot of recycling of those sorts of players going through. Anyway, that's the majority of my my IPL takes off the top of my head, just having a look at it, kind of waiting to see what would happen and how it would break out. So RCB and Mumbai are probably the two more interesting, I suppose Gujarat as well, the three most interesting teams, just because there's a lot of retooling that will have to go there. So it'd be really fascinating to see how those teams go in the draft. Anyway, let's take a quick break here. And then after the break, we'll come back. It says, while pressing the wrong button. Yeah, after the break, we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about Darren Bravo is something that I think is quite interesting in the scheme of cricket where we are at the moment. This is Uncovered. I'm Jared Kimber. There is no Bayram. I mean, there is still a Bayram Kazi, but he's not here. Have you ever wondered how I watch so much cricket? I use VPNs to log into accounts from all around the world. But because before, even simple things like when something exciting would happen in a match, I would rush over to social media, and when I got there, the clips would say something along the lines of, "This video is not available in your area." In fact, most of the coolest cricket stuff in the world at the moment is geo-blocked because some random board didn't sign a deal where you happen to live. If you're a hardcore cricket nerd, the only way is to have a VPN, and we suggest Surfshark. They will give you the speed of your favorite quick bowler. They're as inventive as a T20 batter after a bunch of dot balls, and they're as secure as a specialist wicketkeeper with the softest hands in the world. And guess what? The kind folks at Surfshark are going to give you a deal. Enter the promo code Kimber for an extra 3 months free at surfshark.deals/Kimber. There are probably other things that Surfshark can help you with, like data and identity theft and traceability and intrusive advertising. But for us, it is our best weapon against the evil cricket geo-block. Go to Surfshark and type my name in, KIMBER, and get 3 months free today. Welcome back. Yeah, I just want to talk about Darren Bravo just a little bit, because we've entered a period, probably since late 90s, of where West Indian cricket has not been as strong as it should be. And, there's a lot of talk, the old basketball myth, they're all going to play basketball. Not sure Darren Bravo had much of a chance of doing that. And, me and Michelle have kind of debunked that. And I'll do a major video about it one day. I just haven't had a chance to get involved. But, the really important thing is that there is still talent involved in West Indies cricket. The problem is the development of that talent, of keeping it around, of getting it to reach its apex as early as it should. So, me and Michelle have done a podcast about Johnson Charles, I think, which is coming up probably in the next couple of weeks. And you look at Johnson Charles and you look at his key skills, hand-eye coordination, power, his ability to be very skillful on the offside, but also then have this, big fuck off heave to the leg side whenever he needs it as well. And then you And then you start to go through his record, and you're like, well, why did this all take so long for it to develop into a player? Because he's been around the international scene for a long time. It hasn't always been a frontline franchise player. I think he was just let go by his IPL franchise as well. And he's probably not quite at the IPL level, but not far away from it at his absolute best. The truth is, these players just aren't developing correctly within the West Indies. And I think Darren Bravo is a really good example of that. And there's many different things. I think the Bravo family have probably been seen as a little bit difficult at times. Obviously, Dwayne was involved in the union, well, not even the union, the strike. So that was a part of it. Trinidad and Tobago have certainly had some problems. Obviously, Nicholas Puran is another one that they had some issues with. So there's some issues there that come through. But the truth is that, at the end of the day, it's West Indies cricket that needs to develop those players. And in Darren Bravo, you have a player who has a fantastic test record, for instance, away from home. He's just done absolutely great in the Super 50 tournament over there. Not been picked again. And we're now looking, I'm just having a look, was it a 13-year professional career? And it's kind of 56 test matches. What's he played in one day? It's 122 ODIs, and he averages 36 in test cricket and 30 in ODI cricket. Both of those numbers are lower than what he should be producing. And, as I say, there's a lot of different reasons for that. But the truth is that the same things keep happening in West Indies cricket. And this isn't someone who is getting a lot of T20 major contracts or anything like that. So you can't just throw the T20 thing in. The truth is that, especially when it comes to West Indian batters, although I'd say the all-rounders and spinners and the quicks also come into this at times, but certainly with the batters, they just don't develop. And so what you usually get is when they reach their peak age, so around that 27, 28 period, like Johnson Charles has, they suddenly have, a little bit of a renaissance, and we all start to see them as a good news story again. But then quite quickly, they're out of the side again not long after that. And with Darren Bravo, it's way more confusing with that. Of course, he's famous for, I think, calling then Cricket West Indies CEO or chairman. It must have been chairman, wasn't it? A big idiot, Dave Cameron. Shout out to him. Probably not the least accurate thing that's ever been said about Dave Cameron, but also not a great idea. But not a great idea, I should say. But the point being that this keeps happening in West Indies cricket, and it's not just a T20 thing, and it is not just a current day thing. As I've said before, you go back into the history of West Indies cricket, a lot of the time when they really developed their players, it was with the help of league cricket in England, county cricket, Kerry Packer, all those different things to allow those players to become professionals. And now that a lot of those things are now clogged up by Sri Lankan players and Pakistani players and South African players and, Zimbabwean players. So it isn't just that everyone turns straight to the West Indies. There are many different other players who sometimes get picked up. But if that's the case, how is the West Indies ever going to develop their players? When they had that, great period where they were doing so well in T20, that was largely, again, on the back of a lot of those players getting picked up by leagues and becoming professionals, right? The talent isn't the issue. And I think that's always the thing with Darren Bravo. It's going to be a very sad story. I know he's recently said he's stepping away from international cricket. Actually, it might have been from all cricket. I can't remember what the actual what he said exactly. But the point is that we just keep seeing these things, these trends. And the fact that it comes a week after Marlon Samuels has been suspended, over fixing charges as well. We just keep seeing the same patterns over and over again. The inability of Cricket West Indies to ever find out a structure that can actually develop their players, that can keep them happy, that can keep them on side. And a lot of it is about geopolitics. And a lot of it is, about the fact that they are not one place. And, they are many different places. And a lot of it is about finances. But when people say, oh, it's such a shame that West Indies cricket is in the state they're in, I think we need to go back and actually start to focus on, we never really gave the West Indies as a cricket board, never actually cashed in on the fact that they could have made a lot of money throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, even into the early 2000s, based on the heritage, the way they were marketed, they made a lot of money for Cricket Australia and the ECB, and probably, you know, even early days in the BCCI. They made a lot of money for much richer cricket boards, but because of the way that cricket is structured, that money never filtered back to the people who actually should have earned it. And I'm talking about the players on the field, but also, you know, what would have been WICB then, but, you know, WICB or Cricket West Indies. And it's a real shame, and I don't see any of that changing. And on all of that, this is slightly more upbeat or downbeat, depending on how you want to do it. But the African regional qualifiers for the T20 World Cup are going on at the moment. And you will know this most probably because you will know that Uganda has just beaten Zimbabwe. And if you don't know that, it's a hell of a way for me to just drop it for you. But absolutely fantastic for Uganda. Someone actually asked me a question on Twitter today about how did the associate teams suddenly get so good? But the truth is that associate teams have been getting good. Well, you could argue since Sri Lanka, right? Like since '79, you know, because straight after that you have Zimbabwe, and then you have Kenya, of course. Then you have Scotland, Ireland, Bangladesh, and now and then Afghanistan as well. The truth is, the ICC also put a lot of money in, and there's also the fact that what happens is that because there are ICC events to go to, those teams that had played cricket, and you know, Uganda cricket has been involved in Uganda for a very, very long time, but beforehand they weren't going to get test status, right? Or at the very least, they were going to have to be good for such a long time to get test status. What has happened now is there is a pathway, and there is a reason for those teams to go, and there is potentially sponsors, potentially government money, and also ICC money that can trickle down to some of these teams. Trickle down maybe being the operative word. So it's an absolutely great day again for associate cricket to be seeing Uganda beating a test playing nation. Of course, the other side of that is that not particularly good for Zimbabwe. Again, very, very reliant on Sikandar Raza and Ryan Burl. You know, I've talked about that a lot, how reliant that team is. They're basically reliant on their bowlers, and their batting just isn't as strong as it needs to be. But, you know, in that particular game, I think Blessing bowled 4 overs for 13, which is incredible, trying to defend 137 in a T20 game. Ngarava went 2 for 24 from his, but Tendai Chitara got smashed around a little bit. Sikandar got milked, maybe more than smashed, but certainly went for runs as well. Ryan Bell went for runs. And they obviously needed all their bowlers to step up again in that situation. To go back to the West Indies thing, I don't think it's a problem if Zimbabwe and the West Indies continue to struggle from a sport perspective. Because at a certain point, they are going to have to work out what they are doing is wrong and if there is a better way of being able to do it. Now, there may not be. I would find it hard to believe that they couldn't make a few different improvements in the way that they do their cricket. But overall, I think it's very, very fair to say that they are not in as advantageous position as some other, you know, cricket nations around the world, right? Like, for instance, Ireland. The other way of looking of course, of all this is that when Uganda beat a test-playing nation, that shows how much they are developing and how much stronger cricket is. And if you go back to what I was talking about in the T20 in ODI World Cup about how we could have had 14 or 15 sides in that World Cup without really having a proper weak team. Doesn't mean one of those other sides wouldn't have turned up and been awful, because that's always possible. But we wouldn't have had the sort of situation that we had like the UAE playing in 1996, for instance. You know, those sorts of things. It's incredible how quickly cricket is developing. So Uganda is a horrible thing if you're an old Zimbabwe head, a 90s kid probably, but also a brilliant thing for world cricket to be able to watch that. And if Zimbabwe don't qualify, it will be a hell of a fall for a team that not that long ago was playing absolutely brilliant cricket and suddenly has just completely fallen off. They should have qualified for the ODI World Cup, and they're now in a situation where, you know, they're losing to Namibia and Uganda. They've got a couple of weaker teams to come up, but it's going to be hard for them to qualify from here. And, you know, they'll probably need Uganda to be upset or something along those lines for that to go forward. as well. But just another huge moment in cricket, and we've seen so many of them over recent times. Let's take another break, and then after the break, we'll talk about the ICC's decision on trans players. I'm Jared Kipper. This is the Uncovered podcast. Bayram is locked in my basement.
A few years ago, I had a panic attack after ESPN Cricinfo made me their global writer. I'd earned that position, but I also felt like a fraud at the time because I didn't really understand how I wrote. I understand that there was a process and gears and different styles and things, but how it all came together felt a little bit random. And so I began to panic like a golfer with a natural swing, worried one day I'd just end up with the yips. And would my career be over? So I took my writing apart piece by piece until I understood it. And then I figured out I could teach others all the mistakes I had learned. So I started an online course where I tried to make it as cheap as possible so people like me would be able to afford it. It's called Fans with Laptops, and heaps of people from around the world have used it so far, from first-time writers all the way through to professionals trying to improve. I started with a simple plan to make each writer the best they could be. And from the feedback I've received over the years, it seems like the course does that. But after COVID, my career changed. I came to YouTube, started podcasts, wrote emails, and formed a new career on my own going forward. So I now had something else to offer, the multimedia side of things, social media and everything else. Not to mention that I was building everything up as an independent. And so I added all of that to my course. So if you have ever wanted to work in sports as a writer or podcaster or making videos or anything else, Fans with Laptops is the place to start. If you think you qualify as a fan and you have a laptop and you want to work in sport, click on the link.
All right, welcome back. So I have a few issues with the ICC making this this ban, and the first one would be that having followed a few other sports, and I've been really interested to see where cricket will go with this, but having followed a few other sports, I think probably rugby would be one of the major ones. There's been a lot of research done and a lot of science, and I don't think that the ICC has done any of that. And my worry is always when you lead with, especially for what is in cricket, let's be honest, majority old conservative men making a decision based on women's sport when most of them don't actually care all that much about the women's game anyway to begin with. You know, the funniest thing about, well, it's not funny, it's pretty tragic, but you know, the ironic thing about so many people being so upset that trans athletes are playing in women's sport is the fact that a lot of those people don't seem to support women's sport or follow it or care about it at all until there is a trans athlete involved. And that's sort of what this looks like from the outside, right? And you know, I would love to know a lot more stuff about it. And I know that certainly what happened here was that the Canadian Danielle McGahey, I think that's how you pronounce it, her name. I think that's right. Has kind of forced the ICC's hand a little bit here with the way that, you know, with the decision by Canadian cricket, but this could have been a decision, you know, kind of anywhere. And, you know, I think we saw, I think we certainly saw that this was a something that was forced on them, which is fine. I don't think they can really sit their heads in the sand. Like, this has been something that's been happening in professional sport for a very, very long time. And the fact that the ICC waited until a trans athlete was picked for a national team just shows you how reactionary they have been and how little research and how little thought they've put into it. So the ICC said in the statement, the changes to the gender eligibility regulations resulted from an extensive consultation process and is founded in science and aligned with the core principles developed during the review. I just don't believe any of that. Because if that was the case, I don't think it would have followed directly after Canada picking Danielle to actually play. I'm sorry. I think that's absolutely nonsense. Inclusivity is incredibly important to us as a sport, but our priority was to protect the integrity of the international women's game and the safety of the players. There is certainly, I'm not going to get into all that. From a scientific point of view, where I've been really interested about it is that we do know that a lot of the advantages that athletes have as men when they transition to women don't actually follow over. So we know that the whole thing about the integrity and the safety of the game and all that sort of stuff doesn't matter. But there are certain things that you cannot that you cannot deny, right? And I say this as someone who believes trans athletes should be certainly not used as a political football, so to speak, in general, which is what they have been. Let's be honest, this has become a story because a lot of alt-right people have used it as a story. And when you actually start to go through the numbers of how many trans athletes there are, how little impact they have on professional sports, it becomes a little bit silly. And the whole idea of LeBron James suddenly deciding he wants to be a woman so he can be better, all that sort of stuff that you hear about is almost always nonsense. And a lot of trans athletes, are not very good at the sports when they transition into them. But there are things that you can't undo. And I'll just want to explain one for cricket, which is really, really interesting. So if a player does go, as a man, does go through puberty and then becomes, I don't know, let's say 6'4" or 6'5", or even taller than that, let's say 6'6" or 6'7", and then they transition. They're not transitioning to become a professional athlete, because that would be ludicrous, especially for the fact that you would probably not make any money because of what all these sports are doing, although that always seems to be the fear. But if they do transition and then become a woman, what that means is that there aren't many females who actually grow to that height. And, having talked to female cricketers before, one reason they don't always like practicing against men is not because they like that the ball comes on a little bit faster and that, the spinners can sometimes get more revolutions on the ball at a higher speed and all this sort of stuff. It actually helps them practice. The problem is that men, especially male professional cricketers, are far taller than female professional cricketers. So there is always an advantage there. I just don't think any of that was really taken in. And I as I say, I don't think the ICC looked at any of that sort of stuff. We are getting certainly going to a point when it comes to professional sport where the idea that there are only men and there are only women, I think we now know scientifically that's nonsense. This is going to sound like a huge reach, but this actually reminds me a lot of the chucking situation, where we thought there were bowlers who were chuckers and bowlers who weren't chuckers. And then science sort of showed us that actually the vast majority of bowlers straightened their arm. And, no one was bowling with a perfectly straight arm. In fact, it was almost impossible to be able to bowl with that arm. And, whether it be Caster Semenya or the trans athletes, we are finding, we have got all these different spectrums now, players who are, or athletes who are intersex and everything else. Just banning these people doesn't really help. That's not going to stop trans people wanting to play cricket, right? And so it doesn't, and obviously, if you have gone through all the hormone treatments and everything else you need to go through, and I've got friends who are trans, it's horrendous, the whole thing. Like it's a big lifestyle thing, and it affects your body in so many different ways. It's a huge thing. But these people aren't going to be able to go back and go to be able to play as men at the kind of level that they should be anyway. It's probably also no longer, you talk about safety and inclusivity. Well, they're now excluded from that, and their safety is no longer looked at as well, which is another interesting thing that is not looked at as much when we talk about trans athletes. But what I'm trying to say is, I really believe, a little bit like the chucking conversation, is we are going to find out that these things are a lot more fluid than we ever thought they were. And I thought when Caster Semenya came through, that actually allowed sport to realize that, just having two versions of male and female with disabilities spread around those as well doesn't really work anymore. And it'd be really interesting to see if that, the first sorts of major sports who kind of do that and actually start to make a big deal of all that sort of thing and everything else. But I fundamentally believe that this is a reaction to what happened in Canada with Danielle. And I think that she's retired her career, which of course, again, it's not really that she's retired her international career, right? Like, her international career is just over because of a decision by a bunch of people who probably didn't spend as much time or effort. And, they can talk about the science and everything else. They haven't shown us all the details of that. So all we have is a press statement. If someone from the ICC wants to get in touch and show me all the information and how long they've been researching this. But my thought is that we finally had a trans player make it, and they've made a decision off the back of that. And I just don't think that's the right way for a sport of our size to be acting. But unfortunately, It is how our sport acts again and again and again. And one of the reasons that something like this annoys me is because it's no different. I mean, it matters a lot more to Danielle and to the players who are excluded, but it's no different than them not knowing that Kookaburra changed the ball, right? Which is, so on one thing, you've got people's lives that you're fucking with, and the other one, you've just got a ball. But the ICC don't know anything, right? And part of it is the way they're funded and the way that the actual, this isn't having a go at the ICC, because I think they do a great job with the limited amount of funds that are actually given to by the major cricket boards. But the point is that we have the second biggest sport in the world, and too often these things are just thrown together and not done professionally, in a haphazard way. We don't really run the sport in the way that it should be run. And again, in this case, there Danielle, and I'm sure there are other cricketers who are working their way through the system as well, who've had their hopes dashed. But as I said, to me, the human element is incredibly important. But getting things right, having a process, working your way through playing conditions, working, something like the zombie ball decision that we talked about, a couple of years ago, seeing if that is something that can be changed. The fact that we're going to have a World Cup final probably one day, knowing our luck, where a player flicks a ball for 4 and wins the game off the last ball, but the umpire gives them out LBW, and they still lose the game despite the fact that they've just hit a 4, and no one's actually done anything to change any of that. There is an issue, and there are lots of issues within cricket that unfortunately are being presided over by older, out of touch people. And then there's the illusion of science and the illusion of planning. I can promise you that most decisions that are made by the ICC, from people who've been in those meetings, who've shared the conversations with me, are just not professional. There isn't enough research put in. Quite often, when there is research that goes against the general consensus of the room, they will just go against the research anyway. And this seems to me like another case where they got themselves into a sticky situation with what was happening in Canada. And so they came across, they suddenly had been doing all this research about trans women playing in their sport. As usual with the ICC, I don't really buy any of it. Anyway, that's it for me on Uncovered today. Bayram will obviously be back next week. In fact, he'll be on Footmarks in a couple of days. Big thanks to everyone. It's been a bit of a weird week for me, coming back from the World Cup, or coming down from the World Cup. I do have a couple more World Cup pieces. I think Cheyenne's working on one as well. Estelle's looking at Meg Lanning piece as well. So we've got a few big things coming up. But yeah, we're with what happened in the World Cup, we've been sort of retooling everything. But over the next couple of weeks, there will be more and more shows that we'll be putting together and starting to, get them right when we can. But big thanks to everyone for supporting us. Like, subscribe. If you're on a podcast channel, honestly, on a podcast app, one of the most important things is simply giving us a review, starring it, subscribing, and all those things. But I'm Jared Kimber. This has been the Uncovered Podcast, and I will see you again in a couple of days for Footmarks with Bayram.
This video is brought to you by Wicket Cricket Manager. If you're enjoying these live chats, our main channel has even more World Cup videos looking at the greatest performances, the quirkiest stats, and the epic tales of World Cup cricket. This show was made by HCLTech, a company that believes in partnership so much you can read their name on the Australian shirt. This show leans in hard on data and technology, so we are proud to work with HCLTech, leaders in their field.